Hello, it's Elliot here, and today I've got a stack of film recommendations for you, some great movies that I've been watching on physical media, so let's get straight into it. The first film is this little gem, Marcel the Shell with Shoes On. This is a film from last year that a lot of people fell in love with, and it's very easy to see why. This is a mockumentary that follows Marcel, this tiny little shell, as he tries to reconnect with his community that was disrupted during a human relationship breakup. So it's a lovely film, very touching. And I must say that the animation that they used in this film is perfect. I don't actually know how they did it. It looks like stop motion. I don't know if that's how they did it, but it looks very good indeed. It's a very quirky film. I think it's great for all of the family. Kids will probably love this one, but there's plenty for adults as well. This is the UK Blu-ray that has just come out. It's an okay Blu-ray. There are some issues with the picture in terms of poor compression, particularly in darker sequences, so that's something to be aware of. And unfortunately, the only special feature on here is a trailer, and I don't really consider trailers special features because you can just watch them online. But if you want to see the film on disc, then this is the way to go. Next, a film that pretty much everyone will know, Reservoir Dogs, and this is the lenticular version from Viavision in Australia. This is the 4K disc. It's the same disc that Lionsgate released in other territories, but you do get it housed in this special rigid hard box with the lenticular artwork, and there's some art cards inside as well. Reservoir Dogs is of course Quentin Tarantino's feature film debut, and it looks great on the 4K disc. I included this Lionsgate disc as one of my favourite 4K discs from last year, so you can feel safe getting this one if you're in Australia or if you want this collectible lenticular box. The film itself is one that, out of Tarantino's filmography, was never really a favourite of mine, although I do know a lot of people out there still think that his first film is his very best. But this recent viewing of the film was the time that I had the most fun with it, and I think that's in part because I watched it with my dad. He'd never seen this film, and in fact he'd never seen any Tarantino movie before, so he was in for a wild ride, and I can't wait to watch more of Tarantino's films with him. So yeah, that's Reservoir Dogs, a great film. Still not my favourite Tarantino movie, but please do guess which one is in the comments below. This next one is a very exciting release. It's The Bounty from Imprint Films in Australia. This is a wonderful release of a film that I think doesn't get too much attention, but let me just describe it a bit to you now. This is based on the very famous real-life story of the mutiny of the Bounty. There have been numerous film adaptations of that story. Famously, there was the Clark Gable, Charles Lawton one, there's the Marlon Brando version, but this was the latest one from the 1980s, and it's a great film. This version of the story was originally going to be made by none other than David Lean, and he had planned to make this from the 1970s, and he teamed up with Dino De Laurentiis to get this made, and at the last minute they didn't see eye to eye on where the film was going. David Lean dropped out of it and Roger Donaldson ended up making it. It's a real shame because I would have loved to have seen David Lean's version of this story, because David Lean said that the script that he had was one of the best scripts that he'd ever seen, and originally Christopher Reeve was meant to play the Mel Gibson part in this movie, and Christopher Reeve said it was the best script that he's ever read. Nevertheless, this is a very fine film with a great central performance from Anthony Hopkins as Captain Bligh, and it's a very well-made film, shot on location, and they made a replica of the HMS Bounty. Dino De Laurentiis had this commissioned from the original plans that were taken out of the museum to build a copy of the HMS Bounty, which ended up costing them $4 million. So a fifth of the film's budget was used up just to build a replica of the ship. And the film was a flop. It never made that money back. In this box, you get 2 discs. You get the film, which is presented from a new 4K scan of the original camera negative, which it looks quite good, although there has been no restoration cleanup as far as I can tell, because there is still plenty of dirt, scratches on the print, and a bit of stabilization issues at times. So it doesn't seem like it's gone through a full restoration process, but it does seem like this is the best way to watch the film. There are multiple audio commentaries. There's a ton of special features on the second disc, including a making of documentary and a feature looking at the history of this story in cinema. So a great set from Imprint. I highly recommend it. Lately, I've been getting into racing, and in particular Formula One. And I had a look at my film collection and I was looking at films to visit and revisit based on this, recent interest of mine. Of course, I had to go to Senna, the very famous documentary from Asif Kapadia, looking at the life of Ayrton Senna, famously noted as one of the most gifted, best Formula One racing drivers ever. And this charts his life, his career in Formula One up to his untimely end. And it's a beautiful documentary. The film is almost entirely made up of footage from the time of these races and interviews with Senna, press conferences, and it looks at his rivalry with fellow driver Alain Prost. And their rivalry is so thrilling to watch in this documentary. The way that the documentary is structured, it really does keep the tension between these two fantastic drivers. So not only is this a fantastic tribute to the man himself, but it's also a great tribute to the sport of Formula One racing. I highly recommend it, even if you have no interest in racing. The documentary itself stands alone as a great piece of filmmaking. And a natural follow-up to Senna, I went back and looked at John Frankenheimer's Grand Prix from the 1960s, famous film with James Garner, Toshiro Mifune, Yves Montand, etc. This is a wonderful film. It's a very long film at almost 3 hours, but this is honestly a spectacular film. And I think John Frankenheimer is, when you look at the history of cinema, he is an underrated film director. He has, of course, made so many great films like The Manchurian Candidate, The Train, 7 Days in May, etc. He doesn't really get brought up in conversation a lot, or at least the conversations that I have. And I think he's a great director. This film really does show why. There are a number of great racing sequences, particularly the opening one and then the closing one of the film. And famously, the actors in this film actually had to drive these Formula One cars, which is a very dangerous thing to do, not just today, but back in the 1960s when the safety was just not there. You have the actors like James Garner taking on this role, learning how to drive these cars, and because of you actually seeing the actors in these cars going incredibly fast, it makes the film feel so real in those sequences. Perhaps the only place where the film kind of falters is in some of the melodramatic sequences that are not on the racetrack. So these are conversations between characters where it can kind of just get bogged down in the pacing. But I think that does not detract from the film at all, really, because those races, honestly, some of the best races to ever be put on film. I have another car film to talk about. This one not actually to do with racing. This is Tucker from Francis Ford Coppola. I should say that the full title is Tucker, the Man and His Dream, which is a very apt title because in many ways this actually mirrors the director himself, Francis Ford Coppola, and his dream of filmmaking. Tucker was a real-life man who had this idea for this different kind of car, and he faced many challenges in the motor industry to try and get this car into production. And we see that story from the initial idea right up to the end when he'd actually made some of these cars. This is not one of the director's films that gets talked about a lot, but I think that's a real shame because he made so many great films, not just talking about the Godfather films or Apocalypse Now. Many other films in his career are so good and so overlooked. And I'm hoping that with the release of Megalopolis, which I think is going to be coming out next year, hopefully, that we'll see some look backs at his career and some of the underseen films in his filmography. And now I just want to touch on this film, Bleak Moments, from brilliant British filmmaker Mike Leigh. So important for this country's film industry. And this was his feature film debut. In this film, you see a lot of what we would come to expect from his type of filmmaking. Realistic characters, dialogue that does not feel contrived, it feels real. And this film in particular has a lot of awkwardness, a lot of cringe-worthy moments, because we're following this character, this young woman who is a receptionist, and she has to look after and care for her sister. And it's looking at some of the interactions she has with people in her life. And it really is awkward and bleak, as the title would suggest. This is a great disc from the BFI, remastered from a 4K scan, and some great special features on the disc. So if you're in the UK or if you want to import this one so somewhere else, I highly recommend getting this because I don't think it's available from any other labels around the world at the moment. So I hope you enjoyed these quick movie recommendations. If you want similar movie recommendations from me, then just stick around on the channel, click the video that's presented on screen right now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.